Okay, so today's lesson we're going to be looking at which groups benefit from change and which do not. So like in last lesson, as we saw, the changes that are taking place in Afghanistan can at times be seen to be progressive, as it is designed to benefit those most marginalised by traditional Afghan society, which is women and youth. Whether or not the changes are beneficial to these groups is not as easily defined, which is what we've kind of looked at already. So whilst it's certainly the case that some groups within women and youth have benefited from the changes in Afghanistan since the ousting of the Taliban, not all of those groups have. The main groups that have benefited from the change are urban, middle and wealthy class youth and women. This is mostly, as we know, due to the fact that these two groups have the greatest access to the changes being implemented in Afghanistan. And we know this is the case, as previously mentioned, because of the restrictions of bringing change to rural areas, both for financial reasons as well as major resistance to changes, as well as the lack of infrastructure to allow for those changes to be taking place in those rural areas. Also, as most of the changes being made for women and youth challenge the traditional power structures within Afghanistan, it's also evident that men, especially rural men, do not benefit from these changes. Okay, so the first group that we're going to look at is urban wealthy women. So wealthy landowning and business families for most of the 20th and 21st century have had access to education, excluding Taliban rule from 1980s and to 2001, which has increased since the ousting of the Taliban, especially for wealthy urban women, which is what we kind of know already. Access to quality education has increased due to enhanced infrastructure and focus on education. So as we know, since the ousting of the Taliban, girls' education became at the forefront of government initiative, and we know now that 40% of primary school students are girls and 27% of high school graduates are girls. So there's clearly a significant increase, which, as we know, is increasing that availability of girls in schools, but also women having greater access to universities. This is demonstrated by the fact that urban wealthy, or just necessarily urban women, have greater access to education, as 34% of women in Kabul are literate and 68% of men are literate, which compared to rural areas, it can be sometimes as low as 1.6% of girls being literate compared to 41% of boys. So we can just see that in just comparisons of cities and rural areas, girls are still receiving significant more education, as like I said, 34.7% of girls are literate in Kabul compared to 1.6% in some southern provinces. Boys and girls from wealthy families usually study abroad as well, which is providing women with greater opportunities and safety, as we know, girls' schools are still under attack in Afghanistan, with 631 schools being bombed between January and November in 2009, of which were the majority of girls' schools, and we know that 453 of those schools are still not open. So having the ability to send your kids overseas with the opening of the borders from the ousting of the Taliban has provided greater opportunities for those children because they have regular interrupted schooling. So as a consequence of female increasing education, as we know, dowries increase due to their greater education levels, which provides them potentially with securing more safe and secure partnerships. Families that are spending a lot of money on educating their girls don't want to see that being wasted by being just completely confined to the home. So they'll usually try to secure a more secure, modern, progressive member or partner to get married to. And as we know, this also increases their employment opportunities, as it allows them to branch outside of familial connections. They have, if they have a high degree of education, both university and high school, it means that they don't necessarily need to rely on their family to find them jobs, which is especially beneficial for some women if male family members do not agree with their line of employment, so they can kind of get that employment opportunity outside of their family home. Also, there's been increases to their freedoms of movement, especially for urban wealthy women, as they have greater control over their lives, especially because of the fact that they are not being subjected to the control of the zhergas or the mullahs in these urban areas. As we know, the government has more of a say than those traditional power structures. Urban dwellings also provided greater access to health facilities, both due to location and finances, as they, like we've discussed, being in cities means you're more closely proximated to services, and that means travelling to hospitals is not necessarily that difficult, and there's more abundance of hospitals and health facilities in cities than there are in rural areas. And also it costs money, so being a wealthy person or from a wealthy family means that you can pay for that healthcare a little bit more easier than others may be able to. However, the benefits are limited by the extent of the resistance to these changes. So whilst we know women still make up 27% of government seats in Afghanistan, there's still significant resistance to their place and position in government. So in 2012, 2 Afghan women's affairs officials were killed. So these were elected female government heads. So Najia Siddiqui shot in the head in December 8, and Hanifia Safi was blown up by a roadside bomb in July, and they were both targeted assassinations. Also, public jobs like in acting and film and TV are also highly contested positions for women, and it's very hard for them to be in there. Another example of this is Benagasha, Arizar and Tamana, who were female actors, were attacked by 6 men with knives in September 2012. They didn't die, but they were attacked. And Sahara Panian, she was a very prominent actress and very popular in TV shows, has had to go into hiding after receiving several death threats in 2012. So whilst urban wealthy women have lots of opportunities and can access those opportunities, they're not always given the right to do so, and there's considerable resistance that they have to face due to them accessing those rights. Okay, those that also benefit from the changes are urban wealthy youth. So as we know, again, urban areas have greater access to these changes and compared to rural areas. So urban wealthy youth have greater access to education, which is what we know already by seeing the literacy rates in urban areas compared to rural areas, which therefore means that their employment opportunities also increase. This is a significant benefit, as since the youth unemployment is twice the national average, which is 16% in 2014, this is very important. If you have greater education, you definitely have greater access to employment, and it kind of puts you at the top of the highly competitive job market in Afghanistan at the moment. They also have greater access to technology and electricity, which allows the youth to have greater freedom of choice and movement. As we know, car ownership is up to 28 per 1,000 people, with the greatest growth in cities. So being able to move just by driving around and have control of where you move is very useful, especially in cities. 33% of Afghan nationals have access to electricity. So that's a very small amount. Not even half of the population have access to a reliable 24-hour electricity. However, comparing that to cities, 70% of Kabul residents have access to reliable 24-hour electricity. So this is significantly more than their rural counterparts. So if you combine their access to technology and electricity with their higher literacy rates, they have significantly more access to social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And this is really important in Afghanistan because it provides the youth with a voice. It also provides them with the ability to communicate and interact with people with less restrictions, and it also allows them to interact with and engage with the political parties and political governments, and potentially act for and affect change. Yeah, so groups that have not benefited from change, one clear example of this is rural women. So the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan has impacted basic irrigation infrastructure that existed, leading to the destruction of over 70% of fertile farming land, and it has also caused thousands of deaths and injuries. So because of this destruction, because of the amount of death that has occurred between conflicts between the 1970s to, well, even now, there's still considerable conflict going on in Afghanistan. Many families have been left without a working patriarch. This is kind of encouraging families to turn to poppy cultivation, as it is the only produce that grows in abundance in the arid Afghan environment. Even with the destructed farm lands, they're still able to grow opium and poppy seeds, which is increasing the drug abuse in Afghanistan, which is further compounding on poor families affected, because many of the drug-affected or drug-addicted people in Afghanistan are young men, so again, part of the patriarch. So how this it kind of ties in with women is education, as we know, is also being limited in rural areas due to a lack of funding and infrastructure, as well as greater control by the patriarch restricting female education. So many mullahs and jirgas still don't want girls to be educated, and so they make it very difficult for them to receive an education, or they make it very difficult for the government to build schools. So there's some areas that just don't have schools available for girls, and they have to travel significant distances to access education. And again, this is demonstrated by the school attacks and continuing low rates of female literacy in these areas. All of this combined together is representative of the struggles rural women are having to access the changes in education and employment. If you've got your lack of male working patriarch and the limited skills that come from the lack of education these women are seeking or receiving, this leads to women having to mostly beg in public areas, because if your husband can't work and you don't have education, you have very little or limited or no education, then you have no skills to work in the workplace. And if you don't own a farm and you don't have weaving skills, your only option is to beg, which is seen as a very immoral practice in Afghanistan. So because of this, it's making them very vulnerable to abuse and violent attacks. So all of this compounding together, their lack of access to the changes, the positive progressive changes that are occurring in Afghanistan, means that rural women are not only missing out, but potentially almost worse off in that case. Rural youth are another example of groups that aren't benefiting from the changes due to a lack of access. So as we know, there's a limited access to education, which is reflected through the low literacy rate, so 1.4% of women and 41% of men, which is compared to the much higher rates in city areas. And the continual attacks on schools, which, as we know, is 613 attacks in 2009, combined with government's inability to establish or maintain education infrastructure in many rural areas, equals to very limited access to education for not just girls, but just the rural youth in general. So only 15% of rural families have access to reliable 24-hour electricity as well. So again, many of these rural youth don't have access to the changes that are kind of taking place through technology and the internet. And yes, only 7% of Afghans have access to the internet outside of mobile internet, with the majority of the 7% living within cities. So that 7% is reflective of people that have laptops and computers and iPads and things like that, and using the internet through Ethernet or Wi-Fi, not necessarily mobile internet. And as we know, 90% of the country is covered by mobile networks, so there's 10% of the country that's not, and that 10% is in rural areas. So mobile coverage, even though it's almost covering the entire country, there's lots of rural areas that still have limited access. So thus these changes occurring in education, health, jobs are out of reach of many of Afghan's rural youth. And that's again because they cannot get access to education and the electricity and technology due to failing infrastructure and resistance to the changes occurring. So because of this, the rural youth continue to have limited freedom of choice and employment, as many are restricted in continuing with the family business based on the skills they gain from their family. Because they're not getting educated, they have to just rely on the skills that their families can teach them, and therefore they don't have access to the new employment opportunities that are coming into Afghanistan with new infrastructure and NGO groups coming in to try to fix and help with developing of Afghanistan. So this is because of their location and their environment, they struggle to access the changes. So poor families is another example of groups that don't benefit from change, again because they can't access. And this is across the board, so we're not just talking about rural poor families, we're also talking about urban poor families. So much like rural youth, they cannot access those changes. And the changes and the examples of this are women from poor families usually receive a limited education, as families who struggle to pay for an education for all family members will typically send their boys over their girls. Therefore, they are generally constrained to the home or forced to beg, as we know, due to their lack of skill or education. However, boys from poor families as well will typically be removed from school at the age of 12 so they can help to support their family. Thus, so even though they are receiving an education, many poor boys will also be removed from school, meaning they don't complete secondary school and therefore their employment opportunities are stunted. Again, their only options is to go into the family business, or to do very basic unskilled labour, which, as we know already, does not pay too well. And due to the loss of farmland and the conflict, many poor families have moved to urban areas in search for work, as we know, which already is placing a large burden on the men of the family, many whom have had a limited education and skills that are only specific to farming, which, as we know, is not very helpful in urban areas. Which, as we know, men are meant to be supporting their families. The patriarch is meant to support their immediate and extended families. But because of their lack of skill and lack of education that many of these poor families have, even with migrating, as we know, they cannot access the job opportunities, and many are unemployed. So around 20% are unemployed or underemployed, so they cannot afford to support their families. Okay, the last group that aren't benefiting from change, this is kind of an obvious one, but it's men. As we know, most of the changes to rights for women and youth is impacting on the influence and control men have over their family members. However, cultural lag surrounding the acceptance of many of these new rights, especially in rural areas, means that family members, specifically women who choose to practice their new rights, can bring shame onto their family. And this is representative, again, of another cultural lag, that maintaining value and belief that men will look after their family. Because of this continuing value belief around men's role in controlling their family, this is significantly impacting the patriarch, as the women and children that try to access these new changes that completely contradict or challenge the traditional cultural and values in Afghanistan puts a lot of strain on the reputation of not only the family but the male patriarch of the family, which is especially the case in rural areas where women have greater freedom of movement and access to education and various employment opportunities. So coupled with the continuing employment practices within Afghanistan, so the reliance on familial friendship networks for jobs, social standing is of high significance, as we know that hasn't changed when finding work, and males that have a tarnished family name can struggle to find meaningful employment, which kind of compounds that impact in the micro world, because if women have gone out and kind of pushed for too much change, and they've got that continuing expectation that they're going to control their women, and that continuing expectation that family reputation kind of provides you job opportunities or doesn't, men are really affected here because they need to still continue to support their families. So what do they do here? Do they allow their women to be able to access these changes, or do they restrict it to in order to gain or get a well-paying job that will help to support their families? This can also have an impact on their meso-world interactions, like joining the Zherga or becoming a mullah, limiting their access to power and authority within their communities as well. Because again, if they have a tarnished reputation, tarnished name, they will not be accepted into the mullah or the Zherga. So yeah, men are really not winning out here.